So maybe you're dealing with a class imbalance with respect to your response variable. And this can, of course, bring about programming challenges when you're at the sampling phase of the model building process. So let me tell you what I did using SAS that made this process much simpler. So a few months back, I was working with a credit card fraud detection dataset on Kaggle.com. And the goal of this competition on Kaggle was to use this historical labeled data to predict fraudulent credit card transactions. And for any of you that work specifically in the credit fraud area, you know that a common problem is the class imbalance that you tend to have as it relates to your outcome feature. That is, the value of 0, which represents in this case no fraud being committed, tends to be most of the data, and the 1 representing the fraud tends to be 0.5% or less. So the challenge for us then is to rectify this class imbalance that we have, but we want to do it with parsimony and flexibility in mind as we develop our code. Now, the most common type of conflict that you're going to have when it comes to the programming approach that you're going to take to solve this problem is deciding if you're going to use the SAS data step fully or if you're going to utilize something like proc SurveySelect. So for example, if you're dealing with a very large volume of data at your company and you think processing speed is going to be a concern, well, then you want to take the data step approach when you do your sampling. However, I think for most of you, you'll be totally fine using a SAS procedure called proc SurveySelect. It's a newer SAS procedure that's made sampling a lot simpler. Let's now get into the coding. So first, you will notice that I've gone ahead and already imported the dataset in question using the SAS data step. If you have any question about that process, please ask that question, no problem. So I'm going to start by sorting this dataset that I've imported. I've called this dataset fraud. And the reason I'm going to sort it is that proc SurveySelect, which we will use a little bit later, requires that the input dataset be sorted, and it needs to be sorted by the variable that we are going to stratify. So we're going to be creating a stratified sample. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Proc sort data equals fraud. So this is the input data set that we want to sort. Semicolon by class. And this is because literally the variable, the outcome variable is called class. Semicolon, run, semicolon. And then we can run that. So the next thing that we have to figure out is we have to figure out the sample size of each class, because we're going to use that information when we use proc SurveySelect to do the actual sampling. And we can use a SAS procedure to find out the sample size of each class. So I'm going to type proc FREQ data equals fraud, semicolon, tables, class, semicolon, run, semicolon. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And you're going to see what we already know. And that is that there's a very large class imbalance as it relates to our outcome feature. We don't have very many cases that actually represent fraud. So now we know the exact sample size for both the no fraud cases and the fraud cases, with of course the fraud cases being much, much less. And we're going to use that information in the next step where we do our sampling. So let me type in proc SurveySelect, data equals fraud. The next step is to pick the method, and we're going to pick simple random sampling, SRS. And then I'm going to input the sample size, specifically the class 1 sample size, which is the fraudulent cases. So that's why the N is what it is. So in case that is unclear to you, N is simply where I get to specify a sample size for each stratum. So for both classes, and the reason I chose class 1, the sample size of class 1, the fraudulent cases, is because I want the same number, the same sample size to also be picked for class 0 or the non-fraudulent cases. So then we're going to have a perfect balance in our class. The next portion, I'm going to type in seed equals, and you can just put any random number in here. Out equals, I'll just call it sample strata, semicolon. Out equals is simply the name of our output data set. So this is where the results of our sampling are going to get saved. So next, I'm going to go ahead and use the strata statement because I am creating a stratified sample, and I just tell SAS here that it is the class variable that we are doing this sampling on. Make sure you have a semicolon there at the end, and then run semicolon, and we can go and run that. And the final thing is we want to print out this output. And to do that on SAS, you just type proc print data equals sample strata. Remember, that's our output data set that has all the sampling results. Semicolon, run, semicolon, and we can go ahead and run that. And there we are, folks. So next time you're in the sampling phase and trying to rectify a problem like a class imbalance, or if you simply want to easily choose a sampling method of your choice, remember it is easy with proc SurveySelect.